Good evening and welcome to the SGK monthly grand rounds. Since Dr. Arun Nemmal is held up with the queues, I'm just showing some interesting case. I think those who are may not, I don't know whether it can be called as a case or not, but it's very difficult to it will be surprising or it will be happy if somebody give me the answers. You can send the answers in a personal chat box to Dr. Pidambaran. So this is a 34-year-old female presented with vomiting after food intake for 1 month duration, yellowish vomiting, abdominal tightness, appetite was normal, there was reduced passage of motion, no melena. On examination, upper abdomen fullness was there. And this is the endoscopy video. This is the duodenal region. This is the esophagus. Yeah, that's it. I think whoever have the diagnosis can send me the message as personal message in my chat box. Now I welcome Dr. Joshi John, our ASGK president, to moderate this meeting.
Thank you, Pidambaran. Welcome you all for this month's session of the monthly grand rounds. Like previous months, we have an interesting case that is being presented by Dr. Govind Jain from the Department of Surgical Gastroenterology at KIMS Trivandrum. He is presenting an unusual case of weight loss and hyperalbuminemia. Without wasting time, I think we can go over to the straight to the case. Dr. Govind.
Thank you, sir. Sir, is my screen visible?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah. Yes, sir. So thank you, sir. Sir, I thank my mentor and moderator for the guidance, and I thank AFTK for this opportunity to present this case. So I'll be presenting an unusual cause of weight loss and hypoalbuminemia. So going straight into the case, it is about a 48-year-old gentleman who had a loss of weight, a loss of appetite, and loss of and loose stools for 6 months. He had 5 to 6 episodes of loose stools daily, which were well formed to poorly formed and was watery in consistency. There was no blood or mucus in stools, and he also had 12 kilograms of weight loss in the last 6 months. There was no abdominal pain, vomiting, bleeding PR, no melena, no hematemesis, and he also had associated pedal edema. There was his previous history was significant. He had a history of laparotomy at 10 years, even though he couldn't recall any details and no records were available. There were no comorbid illnesses and he was not on any regular medications. And there was no family history of malignancy. With these symptoms, he actually presented to an outside hospital. There he was evaluated with colonoscopy, some basic labs and colonoscopy. The colonoscopy showed only hemorrhoids and the rest of the colonic mucosa was normal. CT, a contrast-enhanced CT of the abdomen was done outside in the outside hospital, which showed a 4 into 4 into 3 centimeter lesion in the presacral and coccygeal region with indentation in the posterior wall of rectum. Only this was reported or picked up in the CT. And in this outside hospital, he underwent an EUS, a transrectal FNA of the lesion, and the biopsy from the lesion was inconclusive. However, 1 week after the FNA, he developed lower abdominal pain, which increased defecation, and he also developed fever spikes. After developing fever, he came to us for further management. And now I'll be presenting the evaluation and evaluation in our hospital. On examination here, he was conscious, oriented, vital, stable. He was malnourished with a BMI of only 18.5. His weight was only 48 kilogram, height 161 centimeter. His vitals were otherwise stable. Had some tachycardia, and per abdominal examination showed only a healed transverse scar in the right upper quadrant. There were no other palpable mass, no distension. It was non-tender and bowel sounds were normal. And his HB was low at 8.3. Total count was 9,200 and CRP elevated at 84. Albumin was low at 2.2 and proteins were 4.6. So as a beginning of our evaluation, we decided to review his previous investigations. And this is the CT, which was done previously at the outside hospital before the FNA. That is around 2 weeks back. So this is the contrast-enhanced CT of the abdomen, axial cuts, arterial face images. This shows a dilated stomach. You can see the duodenum. And here we can see the proximal jejunum. The DJ flexure, it is crossing the midline, but the proximal jejunum is then going towards the right side of the abdomen. And it is the proximal jejunum is forming a large loop, loop or a large pocket here. There is some, we can see more in the venous face images. Here again, this is the large jejunal loop, proximal jejunal loop. It is almost so large that it is reaching almost up to the right iliac fossa. This was actually somehow missed in the previous place where he was evaluated. And they concentrated upon this retrorectal cyst. This is the sixth cyst which was mentioned earlier. This appears like a simple cyst in the retrorectal area. There are no calcifications, there are no loculations. There's no arterial enhancement, and it seems to be indenting the posterior wall of rectum. There is no regional nodes, and the rest of the bowel loops also appear normal. There are no, the liver also appears normal. This I'm just showing the sagittal and coronal images to show the size of this dilated proximal jejunal loop. This is the huge dilated proximal jejunal loop. In the coronal images also we can see this hugely dilated proximal jejunal loop. So with this diagnosis, so with this finding, now we were thinking of blind loop syndrome as the primary cause responsible for all of his symptoms. So because we were thinking that the blind loop syndrome may have caused his initial presentation of diarrhea, and this finding of incidental cyst, retrorectal cyst which was biopsied may have been just an incidental finding. So to confirm his present, now he was presenting with fever and elevated CRP. So to confirm this diagnosis, to confirm the cause of this presentation, we did a repeat CT at our institution. Now this other than the dilated jejunal loop, now we can see that this retrorectal cyst is now showing air pockets. and there is also surrounding fat stranding adjacent the retrorectal cyst area. So now it looks like an infected retrorectal cyst. And to manage this, he was started on cefoperazone sulbactam, and after 10 days course, his CRP improved and his albumin became better, slightly better. From 2.2, it became 2.7. The edema also reduced slightly. So now our differential diagnosis were a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth due to blind loop syndrome or a proteinuria, some renal cause of proteinuria. So to exclude this, we did a 24-hour, we obtained a nephrology consultation and did a 24-hour urine protein, which was found to be normal. And so to confirm this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth diagnosis, we plan for an endoscopy and a jejunal aspirate culture. In endoscopy, I'll show the video just shortly. There is a dilated proximal jejunum and jejunal pocket in the proximal part just before the obstruction with reduced jejunal folds, a stasis ulcer in the dilated proximal jejunum, and an aspirate was obtained. This is the endoscopy video. I'll just rush through it. Here entering the stomach, and now we are going into the duodenum. Here we can see we are going into the duodenum and then shortly into the jejunum, where there is a lot of food stasis which is being suctioned out. All these are all residual food which is in the jejunal pocket, which is being suctioned out. This is actually a push endoscopy which is being done. You can see the food residue in the proximal jejunum. And here this is again the food and undigested food material and the food residue in the proximal jejunum. In this, we can see two openings in the proximal jejunum. Here we can clearly see the two openings in the proximal jejunum. One is the jejunal lumen and the blind loop. It's probably resulting from the previous surgery in childhood and some type of side-to-side anastomosis. And so we obtained a jejunal aspirate culture. The jejunal aspirate culture showed a heavy growth of Klebsiella and Escherichia fergusoni. And jejunal biopsy was normal and showed only chronic active jejunitis. So he was started on a rifaximin for 3 weeks, and his albumin improved from 2.7 to 3.1. His edema subsided, and in labs, his vitamin B12 was found to be normal, and folic acid was elevated, which was contributory towards the diagnosis of bacterial overgrowth. His peripheral blood smear was also done, which showed a normocytic normochromic anemia with a relative lymphocytosis. Now we also did an MR abdomen to characterize the retrorectal cyst better. In the T2 fat images, we can see that the retrorectal images retrorectal cyst is hyperindense compared to the muscle. Here we can see that, and in this is the some other T2 sagittal images. So that is in the lower, just in the lower rectum, and it is hyperindense compared to the muscle. And in the MR report, it is the cyst was hypoindense on T1 images and hyperindense on T2 images, suggestive of a benign cyst, possibly a congenital rectal duplication cyst. And the cyst appeared hyperindense in diffusion varied images, which is suppressed in ADC images. This diffusion restriction was reported as suggestive of an infected cyst, because this was done after the biopsy and treatment. So now our diagnosis was a jejunal blind loop syndrome with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth with history of laparotomy in childhood and an infected presacral cyst, which is probably benign. So now we decided to perform to proceed with an exploratory laparotomy to address the blind loop first, because the retrorectal cyst also had to be addressed with an excision, but we had to answer the blind loop first, because that would improve the patient's albumin and would improve the general condition of the patient. And after the patient was stable and better, in a better general condition, we could plan for the resection of the retrorectal cyst. And during the laparotomy, we saw a dilated proximal jejunal blind loop, 5 cm from the DJ flexure, measuring about 10 cm. This loop was excised, and this is the excised blind loop segment. It showed some previous, possibly some previous site-to-site anastomosis of the childhood surgery. This was excised, and we did an excision of the proximal jejunal blind loop segment and end-to-end jejunal-jejunostomy, proximal jejunal decompression through gastrostomy, and a feeding jejunostomy. Post-operatively, he recovered well. The feeds were started on day 3 and escalating gradually. He is discharged after tolerating normal diet and passing motion, and is on close follow-up and shows good weight gain, and his albumin has normalized. So just for a brief timeline of the events, in March 1st, he presented to the outside hospital and was evaluated there, and a transrectal biopsy was done. In March 13, he presented to us with fever and pain. At that time, in March 13, his weight was 47 kilogram and albumin 2.2. We started him, evaluated him, and started him on antibiotics. On April 20, after his evaluation and completion of rifaximin course, his weight had slightly improved to 48 kilogram and albumin had slightly improved to albumin 3. So we did a laparotomy then and excised the blind loop. And on May 20, his weight gain is normal, weight gain is better, and his albumin is now normal. Albumin is 3.9, its weight is 54 kilograms. So now the presacral cyst, I'm just adding this flowchart to show that a cystic lesion, a purely cystic lesion could be managed without biopsy, and if there is suspicion of a solid or heterogeneous cystic lesion, a biopsy is required. Anyway, we'll be addressing the presacral cyst with an excision after his albumin, his weight is somewhat improved and he has recovered well. So some discussion. Sir, shall I proceed with the discussion, sir? The theory part?
Yeah, I think you can.
Okay, okay. So come to the gut flora. It is actually sterile before birth, and colonization starts immediately after birth. The stomach bacterial flora is around 10⁻⁴ to 10⁻⁵, and stomach and duodenal flora. It is actually lower compared to the rest of the intestine because of the acidic milieu. In jejunum, it is 10⁻⁴ to 7, and colon 10⁻11 to 12 colony forming units per ml. The common aerobic genera are Escherichia, Enterococcus, Streptococci, and Klebsiella. Anaerobic genera are Bifidobacterium, Clostridium, Bacteroides, and Eubacterium. They serve several homeostatic functions, protective functions such as nutrient composition, maintenance, formation of bacteriocins and lactic acid, which act against local microorganisms. Structural functions such as IgA, immune induction, immune system development. Metabolic functions, and they have a important role in various vitamin synthesis, biotin, folate, and they ferment non-digestible fibers and epithelial mucus, intestinal epithelial cell differentiation and proliferation, and metabolization of dietary carcinogens. And the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is said to occur when the small bowel is colonized by excessive aerobic and anaerobic microbes than what is normal, and this excessive aerobic is usually present in the colon. These are usually GNB, strict anaerobes, and enterococci. And the ability, why the symptoms, the presentation of SIBO occurs is because of the ability of GNB to metabolize amino acids, deconjugate bile acids, consume vitamin B12, synthesize folic acid, and injure mucosa. The organisms responsible are usually E. coli, but Streptococci, Bacteroides, and Lactobacillus can also be responsible. And there are several factors which limit the normal bacterial contamination of normal bowel. That is gastric acid, enzymatic degradation, enzymatic digestion, integrate peristalsis, and ileocecal valve, and disruption of any of these can result in bacterial overgrowth. So the etiology we can correlate now. The motility disorders, anatomy, motility disorders such as scleroderma, radiation enteritis, Crohn's, all these interfere with the normal peristalsis and the normal bacterial clearance. Anatomic disorders, blind loop, strictures, diverticulosis, and abnormal fistulae between the proximal and distal GIT. Immune deficiency state, gastric chlorhydria, hypochlorhydria, such as in long-term PPI and chronic atrophic gastritis, and metabolic disorders such as chronic pancreatitis and cirrhosis. So the effects, the pathogenesis of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is due to the intestinal effects are mainly due to the malabsorption of various nutrient parts. The carbohydrate malabsorption can occur due to intraluminal degradation, enterocyte damage, and fermentation. Fat malabsorption due to bile acid deconjugation and depletion. Protein malabsorption due to epithelial damage, and vitamin deficiency due to again mucosal damage and bacterial utilization. Vitamin B12, A, D are deficient, and one striking feature is that folate and vitamin K levels are usually in excess. This is because of bacterial synthesis and increased intestinal permeability. So in our patient also folate levels were elevated, and due to this increased bacterial synthesis. Systemic effects can occur. One such effect is D-lactic acidosis. This is a rare, actually a rare entity which can be seen in some patients with short bowel syndrome when they present with altered mental status due to the altered lactic acid metabolism due to the bacterial overgrowth. And nowadays the bacterial overgrowth have even been postulated to have a role in pathogenesis of hepatic encephalopathy and NAFLD. The clinical features are actually very varied and not well defined. There may be bloating, flatulence, chronic watery diarrhea, and steatorrhea even, and some may even present with symptoms related to vitamin deficiency. The physical examination is usually non-contributory, and there may be distended abdomen and peripheral extremity edema due to hypoalbuminemia. So, how to approach a patient with chronic diarrhea? The first-line investigations should include a complete blood count, RFT, LFT, and TSH, and assessment of glycemic status. After this and examination, we should look for some alarm features, which I mentioned shortly. Alarm features which should point us towards a diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease or colonic malignancy. If such alarm features are present, an endoscopy and a management based on etiology has to be done. If there are no alarm features, and if we suspect a specific diagnosis, such as in our case, when there was a CT picture which strongly pointed us towards the diagnosis of a blind loop syndrome, then we should suspect an organic cause, such as malabsorption syndrome. The blind loop syndrome will come under this malabsorption syndrome, or other organic causes such as IBD or chronic infection, parasitic infections. If these are suspected, then investigations to confirm this diagnosis can be done, or an empiric treatment can be initiated. If there is no specific diagnosis, we have to suspect irritable bowel syndrome. If in a patient we have marked as irritable bowel syndrome, if a patient has progressive symptoms, alarm symptoms, or atypical presentation, or if there is no specific diagnosis, we should go for second-line investigation, which are directed at identifying rare causes of chronic diarrhea, such as small bowel enteropathies, hormone-secreting tumors, and laxative abuse. So this is basically what I just mentioned, the first-line investigations. Alarm features to suspect malignancy should include age of onset more than 50 years, GA bleed or tenesmus, progressive abdominal pain, nocturnal pain, unexplained weight loss, fever, and a family history of inflammatory bowel disease or colorectal cancer. So, how to confirm a diagnosis of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? So, previously, a resolution of symptoms with antibiotics almost clinched the diagnosis. However, in search of a tangible quantitative criterion, 10⁵ bacteria per ml of jejunal fluid was proposed as a cutoff, as a guideline. However, it is invasive. The method of obtaining the sample is invasive, and there are always problems with contamination and bacterial culture. So, in modern era, there was a breath test. There was the evolution of breath test. Initially, the hydrogen breath test was done, and which was usually originally used for carbohydrate malabsorption. Recently, glucose and lactose breath test, that is testing for hydrogen and methane after a test meal of glucose and lactose. This has been evolved. However, there is problems with study protocol and cutoff value, which I will mention shortly. And so there have been several guidelines on this. The German guidelines in 2005, Italian guidelines in 2009, and the most recent are the North American consensus guidelines on hydrogen and methane breath testing in GI disorders in 2017. This suggested that the new threshold of 10⁵ colony-forming units per liter of coliforms on fresh aspirate culture is suggestive of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. This is because bacterial levels in normal subjects rarely exceed 10⁵ colony-forming units per ml, and 10⁵, more than 10⁵, which was the previous cutoff, is actually seen in those with altered intestinal anatomy. However, 10⁵ itself is significant. And these North American consensus guidance also gave protocols for conducting and interpreting breath test. So before going forward, in our patient, we didn't do a breath test. We couldn't do a breath test actually because it was not available because of the COVID pandemic, and also it was less recommended because of the risk of COVID, spread of COVID. And so small bowel aspirate culture. It is actually the gold standard in confirming small intestinal overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, but it is not externally validated. It is invasive, time consuming, and the mid and distal small bowel is beyond the reach of most scopes. And there is risk of false negative aspirate if there is contamination of the specimen during retrieval of the specimen. There is contamination with oral and esophageal flora, and there is also some difficulty in culturing the bacteria from the specimen obtained. So quantitative PCR is one technique that has been recently evolved, though it is not widely available. So the method of aspirating, one standard method that is described in books is sterile water flush should be used for the endoscope, and a specific catheter called the Liguori catheter is used, which is passed up to the D2, D3. This is actually described for duodenal aspiration, and after passing this, gravity assisted aspiration of the specimen is obtained. And contamination, because of the risk of contamination from upper GI, sample handling should be careful and done in a sterile manner. And the mucoid intestinal fluid can interfere with the isolation of bacteria in culture. So some centers recommend a mucolytic agent called dithiotretol. However, in our institute, actually, we did an endoscopy, push endoscopy was available and it was done, and proximal jejunal as culture was obtained in a sterile manner. So coming to breath testing, there are 4 sources of intestinal gas which can be swallowed, chemical reactions in the gut, diffusion from bloodstream, or metabolism. Normally, there is around 100 ml of intestinal gas, and hydrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide all can be present. But hydrogen and methane are important because these are exclusively formed via microbial fermentation. And this is the principle behind breath testing. That is, microbes will readily digest carbohydrates, and this will produce gases. These gases diffuse into the abdominal venous circulation, and from where it is transferred to the lungs and then detected in exhaled breath. So according to the North American consensus, before breath testing, a patient should avoid antibiotics for 4 weeks, pro-motility agents and laxatives for 1 week, and should follow strict bland diet and avoid fermentable foods. Avoid smoking on the day of test, and 8 to 12 hours of fasting is needed before the procedure. And also even minimal exertion should be minimalized. And 75 gram of glucose or 10 gram of lactose with water is recommended. The test should measure hydrogen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide. And the diagnosis is confirmed if there is increase in hydrogen more than or equal to 20 parts per million from baseline within 90 minutes, or an increase in methane within 10 parts per million within 2 hours. The some small details about lactose and glucose. Lactose will have is a non-absorbable polysaccharide, so it will have an initial duodenal peak which occurs due to bacterial overgrowth, and a second peak from colonic bacterial fermentation, which will be seen even in normal patients. So both peaks are not required for diagnosis, which earlier it was followed, and the first peak must occur within 90 minutes. Now for diagnosis, the first peak must occur within 90 minutes. The glucose, the problem is it is a monosaccharide which is completely absorbed in the proximal jejunum. So it can be useful in detecting only proximal small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And comparing the both, lactose is more sensitive but less specific, while glucose is more specific. However, this is an area of further research because in several studies there is not very good agreement between breath test and microbial culture. Only 65% cases there is agreement, and breath testing protocols and optimal cutoff have to be standardized. Even though there are some existing guidelines, there are several institutes with several different suggestions. And a better diagnostic yield. Some centers have even recommended a better diagnostic yield if glucose is administered through the endoscope, especially for distal SIBO, because then the less glucose will be absorbed in the proximal jejunum. But again, this is not a standard recommendation and not widely practiced or recommended. And there are some recent advances also, including capsule technology, specifically designed capsules which can identify and measure the bowel gas at various points along the gut. Now coming to the treatment concepts, the goal in treating small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is eradicating the overgrowth of bacteria and removing the predisposing condition. And so for eradicating overgrowth of bacteria, mainstay will be antibiotics. And in case of persistent symptoms, the underlying dysmotility, some other underlying dysmotility, anatomy cause, or an alternate diagnosis must be suspected. And no drugs have been specifically approved for bacterial overgrowth. The most widely used is the non-systemic antibiotic rifaximin. There have been numerous studies regarding this, but still there is no clear recommendation regarding the ideal dose or duration. 600 to 1000 milligrams per day is used, and 5 to 28 days in different institutes. This shows up to more than 70% of eradication of overgrowth. And it is actually a very harmless drug which adverse effects less than 5% and normalization of breath test up to 50% in some studies. However, several centers use systemic antibiotics also, such as several systemic antibiotics, fluoroquinolones, metronidazole, amoxiclav, tetracyclines, cotrimoxazole, etc. These also have been reported in several retrospective studies to have a normalization of breath test in about 50%. But again, the evidence is small. The sample size evidence is based on small sample size studies with different methodologies for measuring breath test, and there are no clear antibiotic guidelines regarding these antibiotics. The non-pharmacologic treatment for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is also there. That is elemental diet. This elemental diet consists of pre-digested micronutrients, which are mostly absorbed from this proximal small bowel. So the concept here is that by giving these nutrients which are absorbed from the proximal small bowel, we are limiting the nutrient delivery to the bacteria in the distal small bowel. And this will cause up to 85% of response. But again, this is based on retrospective data, and the evidence is not very good. And also there are palatability issues and adherence issues. Some other diet also which are low in fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, etc. are advised, but again, the data is insufficient. Now coming to recurrent SIBO, that is up to 44% of patients will have recurrent symptoms after completion of treatment and after normalization of test within 9 months. And in such patients, targeted antibiotic therapy based on the culture sensitivity reports of the jejunal aspirate culture should be done. And also underlying conditions such as anti-motility drugs, PPI, opioids, or drugs which interfere with motility, poor glycemic control, any anatomic predisposing causes should be thought of. And prokinetic agents, use of prokinetic agents in such patients are again an area of controversy where there is no clear evidence. Theoretically, prokinetic agents may help in better antigrade clearance of bacteria, but it can be used on a trial basis, but there is no clear evidence again. And also in patients of recurrent SIBO or persistent symptoms, irreversible causes of such bacterial overgrowth should be considered, such as irreversible causes which may predispose to bacterial overgrowth, such as radiation enteritis, systemic sclerosis, gastric resection, ileocecal valve resection, etc. In such cases, cyclical monthly low-dose antibiotic therapy, that is the expert recommendation. And again, here again, it is an expert recommendation which is not based on any strong evidence. And treatment failure, up to 40% of patients, even after completing course of antibiotics, will have persistent symptoms. This in such patients, alternate diagnosis, any missed factors such as any anatomic abnormalities or any overlapping diagnosis or any rare diagnosis such as disaccharide deficiency, food intolerances, chronic pancreatitis, pancreatic exocrine deficiency, bile acid malabsorption, all have to be considered, and functional symptoms, bloating and factitious symptoms. And so, coming to conclusion, there are several gaps in knowledge in or regarding this area even now. Even a specific symptom that can be attributed to bacterial overgrowth is not very clear, though commonly bloating and chronic diarrhea is a symptom. Even after suspecting bacterial diagnosis, there is lack of a validated gold standard diagnostic method, and there is of the accepted gold standard method, which is bacterial culture. There is lack of techniques to obtain a sterile anaerobic aspirate from the small bowel, and other alternative diagnostic method, which is breath testing. It is again having standardization issues. So there are several gaps in our knowledge, but it is a diagnosis which you have to consider in such patients with chronic diarrhea and malabsorption. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Govind, and the Department of KIMS for bringing up this indeed an unusual case. In fact, the diagnosis of this SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth may be not very familiar to most of us surgeons because it's more of a medical topic. And in fact, I think most of the discussion part which you said also is probably for applicable to cases where you don't have a surgical option, like in our case where you can do a surgical option and control these small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, I'll start off with a couple of questions from which some clarifications from my side. Now, you said the diagnosis of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and what do you think is the cause for this dilated jejunal lobe? Was it diverticulum or a duplication cyst, or what do you think is the reason for this?
Sir, the patient had a history of a laparotomy in childhood, sir. The details are not available. It was probably some duplication cyst for which they have done some sort of side-to-side anastomosis and created a blind loop has occurred as a result of that. But in our resected specimen also, there was an area which looked like an anastomosed bowel segment. It looked like a pocket arising from a jejunum, separate bowel loop arising from a jejunum, possibly a jejunal diverticulum, which just been operated on and anastomosis was done.
Okay, and probably could be rectal. This could also be. Could it be another duplication cyst of the rectum?
That is also possible, sir. In some cuts, the wall appears to be very closely related to the posterior wall of rectum, and the radiologist is also suggesting that it is probably a congenital cyst, and rectal duplication cyst is a common, it's a higher probability DD.
And then to make this diagnosis of small intestinal bacteria, as you had put up in your discussion, there are some objective criteria. Now, how did you arrive at this specific diagnosis of a small intestinal bacteria? Is it based on that aspirate from the jejunum that you got on endoscopy?
Sir, we did the aspirate to confirm the diagnosis, but initially on the after seeing the CT film, such a huge dilated jejunal loop, and looking back, having a patient who is having diarrhea for 6 months, hypoalbuminemia, and no other possible cause of hypoalbuminemia, this looked like a possible cause of small intestinal bacteria. This we did the aspirate culture so as we can be completely sure and confirm the diagnosis. And in the endoscopy or endoscopy also, we could see undigested food material, etc., in the proximal jejunum. So that was almost clinging. We did that to confirm.
And did you get the colony count that high as you reported, or it was just the bacteria that you grew?
Actually, they reported heavy growth, sir. I discussed with the microbiologist, and they informed that it is well above 10⁵, just the cutoff they follow. The report came as heavy growth only.
Okay. But I think your initial antibiotic therapy was directed at the sepsis, probably secondary to the EUS aspiration of the rectal cyst. So that was that sepsis was taken care of initially, and
after that, after settling the patient, we evaluated, did the endoscopy and confirmed the diagnosis and started on rifaximin.
Open for discussion. Other members, please.
I'm Dr. Pidambaran. Yeah. Do you think that it was a side-to-side anastomosis? Because side-to-side anastomosis usually will have 4 limbs. Because it will not be one end going into the. It either could be a side-to-end anastomosis if it like what you are being described. And another possibility, whether I am in a doubt whether, see, when you have a pouch coming out, what is the exact reason to resect the whole end and do an end-to-end anastomosis? Why can't you just remove the pouch alone?
Yes, sir, that question, I don't know what happened initially. I'm not very sure, sir. But if it was just an outpouching, it could have been excised. But there may have been some unexpected. I'm not sure, sir. If it was just an outpouching, it could have been resected. But they have done some sort of. It looks like they have done some sort of an anastomosis to the.
Any suture material was visible?
No, sir. Only this one. Something which looked like a healed suture line, sir.
Okay.
No,
I think
can it be?
I think there was to me it looked like a side-to-side anastomosis for a stricture something, maybe a jejunal stricture. Yeah.
Okay.
And there were 4 openings actually. And we removed
there was
that
4
anastomotic
openings.
segment also was dilated.
Okay.
That anastomosis. So we removed the whole thing and then did a new anastomosis, jejunal anastomosis.
What is the reason for air pockets in the retrorectal lesion?
They have biopsied it, sir. It was biopsied from another hospital. Patient went to another hospital with these symptoms and they did a transrectal biopsy, FNA.
No, that's okay. That may be the reason for that you're saying that.
After that, maybe
is the
it got
reason for air
infected and
pockets.
some air pockets may have formed. Yeah, that's a
No,
problem.
transrectal needle aspiration whether cause air pockets for such a long time.
I don't know. It may have gotten infected, sir. As a result of infection, some air pockets may have formed.
Any sigmoidoscopy was done to know whether there is any communication.
Their colonoscopy was done before the FNA, but
Okay.
colonoscopy was normal. It showed only hemorrhoids.
Okay.
In the treatment part, you said the proximal jejunal decompression was done through a gastrostomy. Could you explain that further? What was the word? I didn't understand that.
Because there was a jejunal proximal proximal small bowel anastomosis in a patient with a borderline albumin, sir. We thought there will be a high risk of leak. So we did a feeding jejunostomy, and also we inserted a tube and brought out through a gastrostomy. It's like a vending this thing, gastrostomy.
So just like a feeding tube you brought out through as gastrostomy. Through the stomach you brought it out. And your idea was
Riles tube. The Riles tube. Instead of putting a Riles tube, you put a transgastric tube. That's all.
And you used to continue to aspirate it, or you just kept it closed?
Yeah, we kept it on aspiration for nearly 2 weeks. Then only we closed. Once we started on feeds and all, no. Slowly we started. FJ was started first. Then slowly only the oral feeds escalated. Because this albumin was, even after rifaximin, is albumin from, I think just before starting rifaximin, albumin again started falling after the infection treatment. After the initial infection treatment, there was some transient improvement. Then again, it started going down and he was having anasarca. Then we started rifaximin. We thought we will get an albumin, showed improvement, but it went only up to 3. It went to 3.2 something, then again it started falling. So we thought we will operate with at that stage because he was not showing improvement. Then at that stage, we were a bit concerned about that anastomosis, and that's why we did the decompression.
Yeah, this decompression, Shabir, you put the tube through the stomach, you put it proximal to the site where you did feeding jejunum.
Yeah, proximal jejunum, into that jejunum.
And that was continuously aspirated. But then that would have got a considerably high aspirate. That would have been a high aspirate.
Then slowly, it was a high aspirate. We corrected it, electrolytes and all we corrected, and slowly we closed it over time, over 10 to 14 days. Yeah.
This patient was on total parenteral nutrition at that time, initially?
No, that time we had a feeding jejunostomy.
And before that, did you give any parenteral nutrition?
No,
before
we
this
didn't give parenteral. I think only enteral with rifaximin only we tried.
And he was tolerating enteral feeds well?
Yeah, he was tolerating enteral feeds.
Okay. Now, there is a question in the chat box put up by Dr. Ramesh Rajan. Is the algorithm for retrorectal lesion, you said biopsy for solid lesions, do you want to qualify that further? So what further you want to say about biopsying so for solid lesions only? Or I think he meant, would you biopsy only solid lesions or cystic lesions also?
No, sir. A purely cystic lesion does not need to be biopsied, sir. Because solid lesion or a heterogeneous lesion, cystic lesion with some solid areas will need to be biopsied because to arrive at a treatment plan, sir. Otherwise, a purely cystic lesion has to be should not be biopsied because of infection risk 1, and because if it turns to be malignant, a transrectal biopsy should be definitely avoided because then the rectum will also have to be removed because the biopsy needle will traverse through that. So cystic lesion anyway has to be treated, but without a biopsy, purely cystic lesion. But a solid or a heterogeneous lesion has to be biopsied so that we can arrive at a treatment plan according to the algorithm.
So how do you biopsy it?
There are parasacral or a transperineal biopsy, sir.
Yeah. I mean, you didn't mention it in the algorithm. That's why I just for the benefit of everybody.
Yes, sir. Transrectal biopsy we have to avoid.
And would you go ahead with excision of all such lesions, benign and malignant, or you will all lesions should be excised?
In our Shackelford, the recommendation is that all lesions, retrorectal lesions, once identified, should be addressed with surgical excision, because one is malignancy risk can never be discounted, and then infection risk and then they are telling in some female patients and all, it can lead to dystocia, some risk like that. So according to the books, according to the literature, all cystic lesions or all retrorectal lesions, once identified, should be addressed surgically.
How close is the cyst wall with the rectal wall?
So it is very closely indenting, sir. That is why the radiologist, their first DD was a rectal duplication cyst as a close and main possibility, sir.
So
very
do you
close.
think? So do you think that we can get away with the excision of cyst alone?
That is, we are not sure. Again, especially now, we are again confused because the cyst has become infected, sir. So the planes will be very difficult. So it will be one thing to consider. It will be very difficult to remove the cyst alone, especially after it has become infected.
Yeah, mostly with the images, but I got infer that it may end up with an anti-resection.
Yes, sir. That may be required. If we can't get the planes, that may be an anti-resection may be required.
And you plan to do it soon or later on?
Actually, now after some 6 months, sir, after he has completely recovered from the previous surgery, it was done in May, sir. After 6 months, maybe, or some after he has fully recovered and is okay for the next surgery.
Now, are these breath tests available in India? These hydrogen breath tests, methane breath, all these, is it done? Probably.
Sir, it is,
you said because of the COVID pandemic, we couldn't have it, but is it done? We are not aware of it.
Sir, we discussed the medical gastro, they are done, not routinely, but they can make it available and it can be done. Some kits are available, but not routinely, sir. It is arranged for it specially, and then it can be done. The hydrogen and methane breath testing both can be done. The lactose test can be done.
In fact, this push enteroscopy was possible in this patient probably only because it is a proximal jejunal cyst. If it is deeper down, probably that is also that option also is not there.
That will be difficult, sir. Yes, sir.
Any further comments? Shubhalal, sir?
Yeah, good presentation. As he said, it is not a case of surgeons. Usually, such cases we go to the medical people. But one thing you have to remember is chronic pancreatitis. We see a lot of chronic pancreatitis. We must be aware of the fact that these patients can also develop SIBO. So you can try some rifaximin in patients with weight loss or chronic diarrhea. Apart from the pancreatic enzymes you are supplementing, you can try that. That's all.
In this particular patient, you gave rifaximin for 2 weeks, isn't it? 2 or
3
3
weeks. 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Okay. And that dose was 400 3 times a day.
550, sir. I gave 550 3 times a day. 550 BD.
Patient is still in hospital or discharged?
Yeah, he was discharged last month, sir. He was discharged 1 month back. Now he's on follow-up. He has come to OP.
Okay. Feeding jejunostomy is removed. No? He's on
Removed,
normal.
sir. He's tolerating under oral feeds. He's tolerating well. He's having weight gain also, and albumin is now 3.9.
So probably he may not be bothered about the rectal problem any further.
Probably, yes, sir. He's now symptomatically he's very much better, improved. So he's not. It's okay.
So if you explain the possibility of anti-resection and possible stoma, all these things, patient may not come for the surgery at all.
Sir, that is a possibility.
I think there is not much to discuss about further on this particular topic because most of us are not well versed with this entity. Any further questions? If not, thank you so much, Dr. Govind.
Comments from Shabir Ali.
Yeah, this was actually managed by Dr. Varghese. I think he gave partial parenteral also when Dr. Joshi Sir asked me.
Ah,
Yeah,
ah.
they tried partial parenteral also along with rifaximin and this thing because his albumin was so low at that time. Then tried to
Okay.
improve it. We could improve it only up to that level. Since it was not further improving, then went ahead with surgery.
Okay. Probably
Then-
that hastened the improvement in the albumin levels.
Yeah, might have. Yeah.
Dr. Varghese Yeldo is there?
No, he could not join.
Okay,
That's
okay,
why.
fine. Okay, okay.
He's
So,
busy in a case. Yeah.
okay. So thank you, Dr. Govind, Dr. Shabir Ali and the KIMS department once again for this interesting case and the exhaustive discussion. Now I think we'll ask Dr. Pidambaran to give the answers for the endoscopy case that he put up. Pidambaran?
Yeah, I am coming. See, and actually, this was the endoscopy report. I think you can see that. 1 minute. Can you see the
Yeah, we can see. Histopathology report.
This was a totally surprising histopathology report for me, because when I saw this endoscopy, I thought that the patient is a young female, should have probably consumed some acid at some point of time, which was not aware of the patient relatives. She probably didn't want to tell about the consumption to anybody. The extensive necrosis of the esophagus, and there was some narrowing of the D1. I don't know whether I didn't take the biopsy from that region. And I asked the patient to get admitted, but the patient was not willing to admit. At that time, they told that they'll come back later. After 1 week, when we got the biopsy report, we called the patient. Actually, they told that the patient is also already dead.
Oh, I see. Within 1 week.
Within 1 week, because just look at a transmural necrosis, extensive transmural necrosis with the. So I was not thinking of a malignancy at all in this patient, and just for the sake of biopsy, I just took the biopsy.
Pidambaran, Dr. Shivalal here. One question.
Yes, sir.
The unhealthy area is visible in the endoscopy, lower end of the esophagus and proximal
Yes,
stomach.
sir. Yeah.
Then I will explain the vomiting, bilious vomiting. You specifically said the patient presentation was bilious vomiting.
Yes, sir. It was bilious vomiting, and you can see the endoscopy also. I think if you want to see the endoscopy once again.
No, you can see the dilated duodenum and I think proximal also.
The bilious fluid were there in the stomach also, and it was difficult to transfer into D1 also. There was some ulcerative lesion in the D1 also.
So that is the second lesion.
That's second lesion. I didn't take a biopsy from that lesion, but the patient typically had a bilious vomiting, and the endoscopy showed bilious fluid in the stomach also.
What is the cause of the biliary stasis?
I don't know, sir.
There is a secondary. Some secondary deposits in this small bowel producing small bowel obstruction.
Maybe I don't know.
Because you in the history you specifically mentioned bilious vomiting. That was the main symptom of the patient. Yeah,
it was bilious vomiting, and even the endoscopy showed bilious fluid in the stomach also.
Pidambaran, CT was done, na? CT, CECT.
Nothing. This patient came for me, came to the OPD. Endoscopy was done. Advised admission. They told that they will come admission for next day or day after.
Okay.
Actually, they didn't come again. Then when the biopsy report came, the staff called the patient relatives to inform the biopsy report. At that time, they gave the news that patient is already expired.
Oh God. Looked like a really acid.
Yeah,
Hmm. Age of the patient, what was the age of the patient, Pidambaran?
35.
It's a young age, very
Yeah.
unusual.
Young female, totally unusual. So that's the reason why I just thought that I'll just.
Okay. Anyway, thanks for putting up the case. Dr. Ramendran is there?
No, he told that he also could not be.
He's not. Okay. So I think today's turnout was quite low. There were only close to, I think, around 16 or 18 participants. Only this probably others are busy with cases or in the OT. So thank you once again to the KIMS department, Dr. Govind and the Dr. Shabir Ali, and for presenting a good case. Thank you, Dr. Pidambaran, for rising to the occasion and filling up the gap of the absence of AML and presenting a case which you came across recently. Thanks to all for the participation and the discussion. So if there's nothing else, we'll call it today. Thank you all.
Thank you, sirs. Thank you.